If you had told me the truth from the start, my father might still be alive. The cabin lights flickered twice before the plane dropped, and for one suspended second, nobody screamed because nobody had time to. Claire Bennett gripped the armrest so hard, her knuckles went white, and across the narrow aisle, Nathaniel Cross reached over without a word and pulled the seatbelt tighter across her lap, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door as if he could will it open through sheer authority. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and the overhead bins rattled loose, spilling a laptop bag and a garment sleeve into the aisle. Claire's ears popped painfully, and somewhere behind her, a flight attendant's voice cracked mid-instruction, telling everyone to brace, brace, brace. She had worked for this man for 3 years, had memorized his coffee order and the exact tone of his silences, and in 3 years she had never once heard him raise his voice. He did not raise it now. He simply said her name, low and steady, and told her to keep her head down and her arms crossed over it. And something about the calm in his voice made her believe, for half a breath, that they might actually survive this. They did survive it, though survive was a generous word for what came after. The plane clipped the tops of a stand of pines, spun once with a scream of metal that Claire would hear in her sleep for weeks afterward, and came apart across a shallow ravine, thick with undergrowth. When she opened her eyes, there was smoke and the smell of jet fuel, and a silence so total it frightened her more than the crash had. She was hanging half out of her seat, her seatbelt, the only thing keeping her from the ground 3 feet below, and when she twisted to look for Nathaniel, she found him already crouched beside her, blood running from a shallow cut above his eyebrow. His hand steady as he worked the buckle loose, and caught her before she hit the dirt. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two people who had shared a boardroom for years and had never once touched. And now his arms were the only solid thing in a world that had just been torn apart. The wreckage told them quickly that no one else had made it. Claire refused to believe it until she had walked the length of the ravine twice, calling out names she barely knew, the pilots, the attendants, a junior associate who had begged to catch this flight so he could make his daughter's birthday party. Nathaniel found her on her knees beside a scorched section of fuselage, her hands pressed to her mouth, and he did not offer empty comfort. He simply sat down beside her in the dirt, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and let the silence hold them both until she could breathe evenly again. It was the first time she had ever seen him look uncertain, and it unsettled her more than the crash itself had, because uncertainty did not belong to Nathaniel Cross. Nothing ever touched him. That was the entire reason she had learned, over 3 careful years, exactly how to keep her distance. By the time the light began to slant gold through the canopy, they had inventoried what little the crash had left them. A first aid kit with half its contents crushed, 2 bottles of water, a road flare, Nathaniel's suit jacket, which he draped over her shoulders without asking, the gesture so unlike him that she almost laughed, except laughing felt obscene with the wreckage still smoldering behind them. As she pulled the jacket tighter, her fingers brushed something hard, sewn into the inside pocket, and out of habit more than curiosity, she pulled it free. It was a small enamel pin, tarnished at the edges, the kind companies used to hand out at anniversary dinners decades ago. She recognized the crest instantly, because she had one just like it hidden at the bottom of her jewelry box at home, the last physical thing her father had ever given her before Bennett Holdings collapsed and took him down with it. Nathaniel's eyes caught the pin the moment it left her fingers, and something shifted behind his expression, a flicker so brief she might have imagined it if she hadn't spent 3 years learning to read every inch of his stillness. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "It was my father's," Claire said, turning it over in her palm, unwilling yet to ask why a dead company's pin was sewn into the lining of his jacket. "He used to wear it every day, until the company folded. I kept it after he passed." For a moment, Nathaniel said nothing at all. He looked at the pin, then at her, then away toward the darkening tree line. And when he finally spoke, it was only to tell her they needed to build shelter before the temperature dropped. His voice flat and businesslike again. The door she had glimpsed, swinging shut as quickly as it had opened. Claire slipped the pin into her own pocket, and did not press him, though the question sat lodged in her chest like a stone. She had spent 3 years believing Nathaniel Cross was simply a man who had been born cold. She was beginning to suspect the cold was a wall built over something he did not want found. They worked in silence to drag branches into a lean-to against the ravine wall, and despite everything, Despite the smoke and the grief and the ache spreading through her bruised ribs, Claire found herself watching him. He worked without complaint, his tailored shirt torn and streaked with dirt, his hands raw from hauling wood, and there was nothing in his movements of the untouchable executive who signed off on layoffs from behind a glass desk. Out here he was just a man trying to keep two people alive, and that man was harder to hate than the one she had spent 3 years resenting from across a boardroom table. Night fell fast beneath the canopy, and the temperature dropped with it. They sat close by necessity rather than choice. The small fire Nathaniel had managed to coax from the flare, casting long shadows across the ravine walls. Claire pulled his jacket tighter around herself and stared into the flames, trying not to think about the sound the plane had made when it hit the trees, trying not to think about her father's pin sitting warm against her palm inside her pocket. "We'll be found," Nathaniel said eventually, though it sounded less like reassurance and more like a promise he intended to keep by force of will alone. "The flight plan puts us within 40 miles of a ranger station. Once they notice we're overdue, they'll search this corridor first." "How long?" Claire asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. He looked at her then. Really looked. In a way he rarely allowed himself in the office, where eye contact was traded like currency, and never given freely. "You should sleep. I'll keep the fire going." She did not sleep, not at first, but she let her eyes close, and let the warmth of the fire and the solid presence of him beside her convince her body that it was safe enough to rest. Somewhere in the dark, before exhaustion finally won, she thought about the pin in her pocket and the flicker in his eyes when he'd seen it, and she understood with a cold certainty that the coming days would not just be about survival. They would be about excavation, layer by layer, of everything Nathaniel Cross had spent years burying. Morning came gray and damp, mist pooling low between the trees, and Claire woke to the sound of Nathaniel, already moving, breaking dead branches for the fire with the efficient economy of a man who did not waste effort on things that did not need doing twice. Her whole body ached in places she hadn't known existed, and when she pushed herself upright, a sharp pain lanced through her ribs that made her gasp aloud. He was at her side before she'd finished the sound, his hands hovering without quite touching, asking where it hurt with a directness that left no room for her usual deflection. "It's fine," she said, which was a lie, and he saw through it instantly, the way he saw through every evasion she'd ever offered him in a meeting. "Let me look," he said, and it was not really a request. She lifted the edge of her blouse just enough for him to see the bruise blooming dark purple along her side, and his jaw tightened at the sight of it, though his hands were gentle as he pressed carefully along the bone, checking for the give of a fracture. "Bruised, not broken. You'll feel it for a week, but you can walk." He wrapped a strip torn from the first aid kit's gauze around her ribs anyway, his fingers steady, his focus absolute, and Claire found herself studying the top of his bent head instead of the trees, noting for the first time the small scar near his temple, wondering how a man who valued control above everything had ever earned an injury like that. They spent the morning searching for water, following the faint downward slope of the land on the theory that gravity would eventually lead them to a stream. The forest was denser than it had looked from the crash site, roots and undergrowth tangling underfoot. And more than once, Nathaniel's hand found the small of her back to steady her over uneven ground, the touch brief and impersonal, and somehow impossible to ignore. They talked, in fragments, the kind of conversation that filled silence without risking anything real. He asked about her family, and she gave him the version she gave everyone, that her father had died when she was in college, that her mother had remarried and moved to Arizona, that she had put herself through business school on loans and grit. She did not mention Bennett Holdings. She wanted to see if he would. He didn't, not directly, but something in his questions circled the subject the way a man circles a door he isn't sure he's allowed to open. He asked what her father had done for work, and when she said only that he had run a company that failed, Nathaniel's expression flickered again, that same brief crack in the composure she had watched him wear like armor for 3 years. "That must have been difficult," he said, and there was something underneath the words, something that sounded less like sympathy and more like guilt, though she couldn't have said why she thought so. They found the stream by mid-afternoon, a thin ribbon of clear water cutting through a bed of smooth stones, and the relief of it was so overwhelming that Claire nearly wept. Nathaniel knelt and cupped his hands to test it before letting her drink, an instinct so protective it startled her, and as she drank she watched him over the edge of her cupped palms. He watched the way exhaustion had stripped something raw and unguarded into his face. He looked younger out here. He looked like a man rather than a title. It was on the walk back, the light beginning to slant gold again, that he finally spoke the words that had clearly been building in him since the previous night. "The pin you found," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I should tell you where it came from." Claire's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice even. "I'd like to know." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might retreat back into silence the way he always had in the office whenever a conversation edged too close to something personal. But he didn't. "There was a deal. Years ago, before I took over as CEO, my father orchestrated it. A hostile buyout of a mid-sized holdings company that had overextended itself trying to compete with us. I was young. I wasn't involved in the details, but I remember the name of the company because my father kept a memento from every deal he closed, and that pin sat in his desk drawer for years before I found it and, for reasons I couldn't explain to you even now, kept it." "What was the company called?" Claire asked, though some cold certainty in her chest already knew the answer before he said it. "Bennett Holdings," he said, and the name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything that had passed between them in the last day. Claire stopped walking. The forest seemed to tilt slightly around her, the trees pressing closer, and when Nathaniel turned to look at her, whatever he saw in her face made his own features go pale, beneath the dirt and the dried blood at his temple. "Bennett," he repeated slowly, and she watched the realization arrive in him like a blow. He watched him do the arithmetic. Her silence had just confirmed. "Bennett, Claire Bennett. You're his daughter. You knew my father's company," she said, her voice shaking now. All the careful distance she'd maintained for 3 years cracking open at once. "You've known this whole time and you never said a word." "I didn't know," he said, and there was real urgency in his voice, real desperation to be believed. "I swear to you, Claire, I didn't put it together until this moment. I was 22 when that deal closed. I had nothing to do with it, but you knew what your company did to mine," she said, stepping back from him, the water bottle forgotten in her white-knuckled grip. "You knew, and you kept that pin like a trophy." "I kept it because it never sat right with me," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, the first true crack she had ever heard in him. "I found out later, after my father died and I took over, that the numbers in that deal didn't add up the way they should have. I never had proof of anything, just a feeling I could never shake, and a pin I couldn't make myself throw away." Claire stared at him, at the man she had worked beside for 3 years without ever knowing his family's history was stitched into the collapse of her own, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had spent a decade sealing shut. "My father died believing he had failed," she said, her voice raw now, stripped of the professional calm she had guarded so carefully. "He believed it was his fault the company fell apart. If there was something wrong with that deal, if someone did this to him deliberately, I need to know." "Then we'll find out," Nathaniel said. And the certainty in his voice was different now, no longer the calm authority of a CEO managing a crisis, but something rawer, something personal. "Whatever it takes, once we're out of here, I will find the truth. I owe you that much." Claire looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the deception she had trained herself to expect from men like him, and found instead something that looked almost like penance. She didn't trust it. Not yet. But as the light faded and they turned back toward the shelter in silence, she found she no longer wanted to walk the 6 feet of distance she usually kept between them, and that frightened her more than anything the forest had thrown at her so far. That night, back at the fire, neither of them spoke of Bennett Holdings again, though the name sat between them like a third presence, impossible to ignore. Instead, Nathaniel told her, quietly, about the scar near his temple, a childhood accident on his family's estate that his father had never once asked him about. And Claire found herself telling him about the last conversation she'd had with her father before he died, the apology he'd tried to give her that she had been too angry to accept. Somewhere in the exchange of small, unguarded truths, the wall between them thinned, though neither of them said so aloud. When the fire burned low and the cold crept in, Claire found herself leaning almost imperceptibly toward the warmth of him, and he did not move away. The rain came before dawn, a hard, relentless downpour that soaked through their lean-to within minutes and forced them into a shallow cave they found half a mile downstream, a hollow beneath a limestone outcrop, barely large enough for two people to sit shoulder to shoulder. Claire sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the water sheet down outside the mouth of the cave. And beside her, Nathaniel worked in silence to dry what little kindling they'd managed to salvage. His movements sharper than usual, tension coiled in every line of his shoulders, since the conversation about her father had cracked something open between them. "You're angry," she said eventually, because the silence had gone on long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation. "I'm angry at myself," he said, not looking up from the kindling. "I've spent 5 years running that company, trying to be better than my father was, and I never once dug into that deal the way I should have. I told myself the doubt wasn't enough to justify tearing open old wounds. I see now that I just didn't want to know what I'd find." "Why didn't you want to know?" Claire asked, and the question was gentler than she'd meant it to be. He was quiet for a long moment, the rain filling the silence between them. "Because if my father built the empire I inherited on something rotten, then everything I've done since, every deal I've closed, every person I've let go in the name of efficiency, all of it sits on the same foundation. It's easier to believe you inherited a legacy than to admit you inherited a debt." Claire studied his profile in the dim gray light, the rigid line of his jaw, and for the first time she let herself really see the man beneath 3 years of careful distance. "My father used to say something similar," she said, "that the hardest part of failure isn't the fall. It's finding out afterward whether the fall was your fault or someone else's doing. He never got the chance to find out. I think it's part of why he never recovered." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, and this time the words carried none of the practiced sympathy of a man managing a difficult employee. They carried weight, the kind that came from a person who understood exactly what he was apologizing for. They sat in silence after that, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the damp chill of the cave. And when a peal of thunder cracked overhead and she flinched involuntarily, he shifted without a word and let his shoulder rest solidly against hers, an anchor against the storm. Neither of them spoke of moving apart. It was hours later, once the rain had softened to a steady patter and they'd ventured back out to check on the shelter, that Claire found the second clue. Digging through the wreckage for anything salvageable, her fingers closed around a slim leather folio, half buried in mud beneath a crushed section of overhead bin, water-stained but intact enough to open. Inside were papers she recognized instantly by the letterhead, not Cross Industries but a smaller firm she'd never heard of, financial documents dense with figures, and a name scrawled in the margin in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Voss," she read aloud, and beside her Nathaniel went very still. "Richard Voss," he said slowly. "My vice president." "These are share transfer records," Claire said, flipping through the water-warped pages with growing urgency. "Dated the same year as the Bennett Holdings deal. There's a shell company here I've never seen before, and it's buying up Bennett shares at a fraction of market value, weeks before the buyout was finalized." She looked up at him, her pulse hammering. "Nathaniel, someone inside your company knew the deal was coming and positioned themselves to profit from it before it even happened. That's not a business decision. That's insider manipulation." Nathaniel took the folio from her hands, his eyes scanning the pages with an intensity that reminded her, briefly, of the man who ran boardroom negotiations like a surgeon, precise and merciless when it mattered. "This was on our plane," he said quietly, "which means someone wanted these documents destroyed, or at least kept far from anyone who might read them." He looked up at her, and something cold and unfamiliar moved behind his eyes, an anger that had nothing performative about it. "Voss has been agitating for a larger board role for months. If he orchestrated this, if he's the reason your father's company was gutted and the reason those documents happened to be on this flight, then he has more to lose than either of us realized." "You think the crash wasn't an accident?" Claire said, the words landing heavier than she'd intended. "I don't know," Nathaniel said, and for once his voice carried no false certainty. "But I intend to find out, and I intend to do it with you, standing beside me when I do." The rest of the day passed in a strange, charged quiet, the two of them working together to dry the documents as best they could without destroying the ink, Claire cataloging what she understood of the financial records, while Nathaniel filled in the corporate structure she couldn't parse alone. It was the first time in 3 years they had worked as true equals. No title separating them, no distance either of them bothered to maintain, and somewhere in the collaborative rhythm of it, in the way he deferred to her instincts about the numbers, and she deferred to his knowledge of the players. Something shifted between them that neither acknowledged aloud. That evening, with the storm finally broken and stars visible through gaps in the canopy, Claire found herself sitting closer to him than survival strictly required. The folio, safely tucked beneath a flat stone, to keep it from further damage. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me without needing more proof than a handwritten name in a margin. You've given me no reason not to trust you," Nathaniel said, turning to look at her fully, his expression open in a way she had never once seen in the office. "If anything, I'm the one who has to earn that from you." "You're earning it," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. Slowly, "But you are." He didn't say anything else, but his hand found hers in the dark, not asking, simply offering, and after a long moment, she let her fingers curl around his. It was a small thing, a single point of contact between two people who had spent years perfecting the art of never touching, but it settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since the moment the plane went down. Whatever waited for them once they found their way out of this forest, whatever truth the documents in the folio would eventually force into the light, she no longer believed she would face it alone. They heard the helicopter on the third morning, a distant mechanical thrum cutting through birdsong, and Claire was on her feet before she'd fully processed the sound, scrambling toward the ravine's edge with Nathaniel close behind her, the flare gun he'd salvaged from the wreckage already in his hand. The rescue, when it came, was a blur of noise and motion, rangers descending on lines, blankets pressed into her shaking hands, a paramedic's flashlight sweeping across her pupils while she tried to explain, through chattering teeth, that the folio beneath the flat stone needed to be preserved, that it was evidence, that it mattered more than anything else they might salvage from the crash site. The following weeks moved faster than Claire could properly absorb. There were hospital rooms and depositions, and reporters camped outside her apartment building once word leaked that the sole survivors of the Cross Industries flight had walked out of the forest holding documents that implicated the company's own vice president in a decade-old securities. As Frode, Nathaniel, true to his word, had not waited for the dust to settle before acting. Within days of their rescue, he had quietly frozen Richard Voss's access to every system in the company, retained an outside forensic accounting firm to trace the shell company's transactions, and personally called Claire every evening, not as her employer, but as the man who had held her hand in the dark and meant to keep the promise he'd made there. The forensic team confirmed it, he told her one evening, seated across from her in a conference room that felt too formal for what they were about to discuss, though it was the only space private enough to hold the conversation without an audience. Voss set up the shell company 11 years ago through an offshore intermediary. He used insider knowledge of the coming buyout to short Bennett Holdings stock before the deal was announced, then bought back in at pennies on the dollar once the company collapsed. He made almost $4 million off your father's ruin, Claire. And he made sure my father never looked too closely at the mechanics of the deal, because looking closely would have exposed him. Claire sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, absorbing a truth she had waited a decade to hear and had never expected would actually arrive. My father spent the last years of his life believing he had failed the people who trusted him, she said, her voice thin. He believed it was his own mismanagement that sank the company. He died still believing that. He didn't fail, Nathaniel said, his voice fierce in a way she had never heard from him before, not in 3 years of boardrooms and quarterly reviews. He was targeted by a man who saw an opportunity and took it without a shred of conscience, and my father's negligence in vetting that deal made it possible. I intend to make that public, Claire. Not quietly, not through a settlement designed to protect the Cross name. I want Voss prosecuted, and I want the record corrected, even if it costs the company its reputation. That will cost you everything you've built, Claire said quietly. Every deal, every relationship, every ounce of trust the board has in your leadership. Are you certain that's what you want? I built a company on my father's foundation without ever asking what that foundation was made of, Nathaniel said. I'm done doing that. Whatever it costs me, I'd rather be the man who told the truth than the man who inherited a lie and called it a legacy. It was that evening, after the meeting had ended and the lawyers had gone home, that Richard Voss made his final move. Claire learned of it through a call from Nathaniel's assistant, breathless and urgent, telling her that Voss had barricaded himself inside the executive floor with a stack of files he claimed would destroy Nathaniel's credibility before Nathaniel could destroy his. By the time Claire arrived at the building, security had cordoned off the lobby, and through the glass elevator, she could see Nathaniel standing alone outside his own office, facing a man whose calm facade had finally cracked into something desperate and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're about to unravel," Voss was saying as Claire stepped off the elevator. His voice pitched low but carrying in the empty hallway, a folder gripped tight in his hand. "Your father knew exactly what I did. He signed off on it because it made him richer too. You want to burn me down publicly. You burn him down with me. And every shareholder who trusted the Cross name burns down alongside both of us." "Then let it burn," Nathaniel said, and his voice did not waver, though Claire could see the tension coiled through every line of his body. "I would rather lose this company than keep it built on what you and my father did to an innocent man's life's work." Voss's eyes flicked toward Claire as she approached, and something calculating moved behind them. The last desperate maneuver of a man who had run out of better options. "Ah," he said, "the daughter. I wondered when you'd surface. You should know your father wasn't as innocent as you like to imagine. He knew the terms of that deal were unfavorable and signed anyway because he needed the capital too badly to walk away. My father made a mistake trusting people who never deserved it," Claire said, stepping forward despite the tremor in her voice, refusing to let Voss see her flinch. "That doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't erase 11 years of a name I loved being dragged through failure that was never entirely his to own." Voss's composure finally broke, his voice rising, the folder in his hand shaking as he gestured toward Nathaniel. "You think exposing me saves you? The board will see this company gutted from the inside. They'll see the Cross name attached to fraud, and they will remember that you're the one who chose to blow it all up, rather than manage it quietly the way any competent executive would have." "I'm not interested in managing a lie quietly," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone made even Voss go still. "I already called the board an hour ago. They know everything. Security is escorting you out the moment you hand over whatever is in that folder. And after that, the only room you'll be walking into is a courtroom." Voss's face went pale, the folder slipping slightly in his grip as 2 security officers rounded the corner, alerted by the earlier call. He looked between Nathaniel and Claire one last time, something venomous and cornered flashing across his expression, before the officers took hold of him, and the folder was pried from his hands. He did not go quietly, shouting threats about lawyers and countersuits as they led him toward the elevator, but the fight had already gone out of his voice, replaced by the hollow panic of a man who understood, finally, that he had lost. When the hallway emptied and the adrenaline began to drain from her body, Claire found her hands shaking uncontrollably, the weight of 11 years finally cracking loose inside her chest. Nathaniel crossed the space between them without hesitation and pulled her into his arms. And this time neither of them pretended it was only comfort. "It's over," he said quietly against her hair. "Whatever comes next, the truth is finally out, and your father's name will be cleared. I promise you that." "At what cost to you?" Claire whispered. "Whatever it costs," Nathaniel said. "It's worth it." But even as he said it, both of them understood that the board's reaction, the shareholder fallout, the reckoning still to come, none of it had been resolved yet. The truth was out. What remained was surviving what it would cost them both to keep it that way. The board meeting convened 3 days later, in a room thick with tension Claire could feel from the moment she stepped through the door. Invited, not as an employee, but as the woman whose family had been wronged and whose testimony the board's independent counsel had requested directly. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, composed in a way that cost him visibly, his hands folded in front of him, as the chairwoman read aloud the forensic accounting summary, detailing 11 years of fraud, the collapse of Bennett Holdings, and the quiet complicity of Nathaniel's late father in a deal designed to enrich a handful of men at the expense of a company that had employed hundreds of honest people. "This is a catastrophic liability," one board member said, his voice sharp with barely restrained fury. "You're asking this board to publicly implicate the company's founder in securities fraud, invite a federal investigation, and tank our stock price by an estimated 30%, all because you feel some personal obligation to a woman you weren't even involved with when this deal was struck." "I'm not asking you to do anything," Nathaniel said, his voice level despite the accusation coiled inside the words. "I've already reported the fraud to the SEC. I've already authorized full cooperation with any investigation into my father's conduct. This board's only decision now is whether Cross Industries faces this with integrity or spends the next decade being dragged through it by subpoena. The room erupted into argument, voices overlapping, accusations of recklessness and grandstanding thrown across the table, and Claire watched Nathaniel absorb every blow without flinching, watched him defend a decision that was actively dismantling the empire he'd inherited, and understood in that moment exactly what it had cost him to keep his promise to her. When the chairwoman finally called for a vote on whether to remove him from his position, citing his handling of the crisis as reckless endangerment of shareholder value, Claire found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to speak. "May I address the board?" she said, and though her voice shook slightly, it did not break. When the chairwoman gestured for her to continue, Claire laid the water-damaged folio on the table, the same one she and Nathaniel had protected through 3 days in the forest. "My father built Bennett Holdings from nothing. He mortgaged his own home twice to keep his employees paid during a recession. When this company's former executives conspired to gut his business for personal profit, he lost everything, including, eventually, his life to the grief of it. Nathaniel Cross did not create that wound, but when he found the proof of it, buried in wreckage that nearly killed us both, he chose to expose it rather than bury it a second time to protect his own position. If you punish him for that choice, you are telling every person in this room that integrity is only valuable when it's convenient." Silence settled over the table, broken finally by an older board member, a woman who had served on Cross Industries' board since before Nathaniel was born, who studied Claire for a long moment before speaking. "Your father's name was Warren Bennett," she said slowly. "I remember him. I sat across from him in a negotiation once, years before this fraud, and even then he struck me as one of the most honest men in this industry." She turned to the chairwoman. "I move we table the removal vote, and instead commend Mr. Cross's handling of this disclosure, contingent on full cooperation with the investigation." The vote that followed was not unanimous, and the weeks that followed were not easy, marked by press scrutiny and a stock price that dipped before slowly stabilizing under the weight of public respect for a CEO who had chosen transparency over self-preservation. But Nathaniel kept his position, and Richard Voss was indicted within the month. And somewhere in the exhausting aftermath of it all, Claire found herself standing in the same rooftop garden where she had once, years ago, eaten lunch alone rather than sit near the man she believed was incapable of warmth. She did not expect him to find her there, but he did, still in his shirt sleeves from a day of depositions, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I looked for you after the meeting," he said. "You disappeared before I could thank you." "You didn't need to thank me," Claire said. "I meant every word." "I know," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his eyes, an uncertainty that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with the two of them standing here, unguarded, for the first time outside the forest that had stripped away every wall either of them had built. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no, and nothing between us professionally will change." "Ask," Claire said, her heart climbing into her throat. "When we get back to normal life, the emails and the meetings, and the version of me that used to keep 6 feet of distance between us at all times," Nathaniel said, "I don't think I can go back to being that man. I don't want to. I want to know if there's a version of this, of us, that doesn't end when the forest does." Claire looked at him for a long moment, remembering the way he had pulled her seatbelt tight in the seconds before the crash, the way he had wrapped his jacket around her shoulders without asking, the way he had chosen truth over empire because he had promised her he would. "I hated you for 3 years, she said quietly, or I told myself I did, because it was easier than admitting I was drawn to a man I thought would never let anyone close enough to matter. "I don't hate you anymore, Nathaniel. I don't think I have for a while." He closed the last of the distance between them then, his hand rising to cup her face with the same careful steadiness he'd used to check her injured ribs in the wreckage of a plane that should have killed them both. And when he kissed her, it was not the practiced gesture of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. It was quiet and searching, an apology and a promise folded into one. And Claire let herself lean into it, let herself believe, finally, that some things that survived the fire were worth keeping. Below them, the city hummed on, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had just taken place 11 years in the making. and above them, the sky stretched wide and clear, the same sky that had once watched a plane fall into a forest and had, against every likelihood, given them both a way back out. Whatever came next, the reconstruction of a company's reputation, the slow rebuilding of trust between a boardroom and the public, none of it frightened Claire the way it once might have, because she was no longer facing it alone, and neither, for the first time in his life, was he.